was a trail of tears. There were so many things going on. And we had something similar happening in Canada as well, and some people always say it's like death by policy up there. But that's not really true. It was all sort of the same kind of colonial oppression on both sides of the border.
Hi everyone, I'm Ayana here at Daybreak Star Radio, the only station to indigenize the airwaves, and today we have a very special guest. She's a journalist and a storyteller and now a documentarian. I'm so excited to have Tanya Talaga here with us today. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Wachea Tanya Talaga Nagisnakas Kamusko Pimojije Pinishish Nagisnakas Anemki Waju Makwa Dodom. So my name is Tanya Talaga, and I'm up with the Bear Clan. My name is Little Bird with Big Wings Who Carries a Heavy Burden. And I'm Anishinaabe from Fort William First Nation.
So when did you first sort of find your love of storytelling?
Where I grew up, also north of Toronto, we were 2,000 kilometers away from my mother's community. My father was Polish Canadian, and my mom, she's from Fort William First Nation. So reading and storytelling, I sort of disappeared in my own mind when I was little, and I always wanted to grow up and be a storyteller. I didn't know how I was going to do it, didn't know how I was really going to pay the bills or anything else. And I kind of fell into journalism, and I figured out, wow, you could write news articles and get paid for that. Mm-hmm. And so then that became sort of my career path after I was in university, and I joined a bunch of campus press, well, 2 campus newspapers, and I just lived there. And that's where I learned how to be a journalist. I never went to journalism school, but I learned how to write stories.
When it comes to The Knowing, which is your book first, and then you turned it into a docuseries, which is wonderful. When did that start? When did that idea start kind of going in your brain?
My uncle Hank, so my mom's uncle, Hank Bowen, he was the one that was looking for any information he could about the matriarchs in my mom's family, in his family, right? He wanted to know more about his mom and why his mom hated who she was, why she thought everything quote-unquote Indian was dirty, why she wouldn't let language be spoke inside of the home that she had with all of her children, right? And her husband, who was Anishinaabe. She never talked about anything about her life of her past or what happened to her at Indian residential school. And Annie, her mom, was just gone. She disappeared, and was taken away to a hospital over 2,000 kilometers away, very far from where she lived, and she never came back again. And so it was actually my Uncle Hank who started this, because he started collecting all of these documents. He started writing letters and trying to find out who is Annie, what happened to her, and by an extension, who's his mom, what happened, what happened to her and her brothers and sisters. Does she have any brothers and sisters? If so, who are they? He knew of one younger sister, but that was it. And it was just this sort of giant mystery, right? And so there was that part. And my mom was always asking me to find Annie. Annie is her great-grandma. My mother was raised by her grandma, Liz, my Uncle Hank's mom. So for her, it was always, Tanya, you got to go find Annie. And she kept saying to me, you're the journalist. Why aren't you doing this, right? And I was like, okay, Mom, you know what? I'm going to go find her. And it was actually, I started to work on finding Annie. I got a call, an email actually, from the community right before the news broke of the finding in Kamloops. And they asked me to come out to Kamloops, to the community, to write the story as to what was happening And they did so because they'd read my 2 other books, Seven Fallen Feathers and All Our Relations, and they'd read my stories as a journalist, and they said, we know that, you are not Shuswap, you're Anishinaabe, but we read what you've got, and we would love for you to come and tell our story, because it's about to get a little bit crazy here.
Right.
And so I did. And it was there that the whole concept of the book came together for me, because I was standing with survivors, and the survivors were all talking about how everybody knew about the children, about classmates or friends or community members or family members who didn't come home from this so-called school.
Right.
And they called that the knowing. I knew that I had to document this. I had to film it. When I was a journalist, a daily journalist, and then I did investigative stuff and feature stuff, somebody threw me a camera at one point saying, because there was cutbacks in the newsroom, and it's like, okay, well, if you want to travel and go out and tell stories, you've got to also shoot.
Right.
And so I started to take photos, and that really opened up a lot to me. The visual of what something looks like and capturing that essence. And sometimes when you're telling the story, if you don't capture it in that moment, you've lost it.
Yeah.
And when everything started happening in Canada with the Lesweway, the spirits of the children, I think, really waking up the rest of Turtle Island, especially our nations too, and our non-Indigenous folks that live in Turtle Island too, to hear this news about what we always said, that there were kids that didn't come home, there were people that didn't come home from the hospitals or the asylums. I realized I had to document that visually, because it'll be gone, and that you can't recreate this. And so I went back to Kamloops 1 year after the Lesweway happened. And I went back with a film crew. And so by this point, I was already starting to write the book. It was all starting to come into my head from being there in May 2022, the end of May 2022, when it actually all sort of broke into the open. And so I went back with...
What do you hope audiences take away from both the Book of the Knowing and the docuseries?
I hope people see the truth of our stories here on Turtle Island, and for a long time, no one taught Indian boarding schools, right? They didn't teach Indian residential schools. They didn't teach the violent history of Turtle Island. Martin Luther King always said that this is a continent born by violence. First, it was against our people. The settlers came, disease came, and then the killing machines of colonial governments came and just killed so many people. There was policies of exclusion, there was a trail of tears, there were so many things going on. And we had something similar happening in Canada as well, and some people always say it's like death by policy up there. But it's not really true. It was all sort of the same kind of colonial oppression on both sides of the border. I can't get into it right now because it's all in the book, but I talk about how it was run by these governors, the Hudson Bay Company governors, that were based out of England, that all had ties to the African National Company, which ran the slave trade. So those ideals, where did those ideals come from of othering us, of those ideals of the Indian Act, which is still a law in Canada? Like, I am a status Indian. I have a 10-digit number beside my name. It's a race-based legislation. Where did all that come from?
Yeah.
I just became obsessed with those ideals. And so when you ask me what I hope people will take of it, I want people to see the true history of this country, and to talk about things like Indigenous slavery, what the fur trade did to our people, the killing of the buffalo, what they did to our people in the plains. And, it's awful seeing what's going on, right, on Turtle Island now with politics and how it all sort of bleeds through. And it doesn't stop. And so I'm a big believer in education and reform, and I really hope that truth is going to hopefully one day lead us out of the madness. What's happened? Like, nothing else happened. That was it. You know, and why I say nothing else, I mean, the Vatican, for instance, the Vatican Museum has